Hey everybody, and welcome back to Video Game SO. Today we're going to continue the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and today I'm going to be doing a video because I get a lot of questions about this. Should you sell your real original hardware? Is real original hardware obsolete? And is MiSTer FPGA the future? And while the answer is going to be something different for everybody, we're going to talk about the reality of what it's like owning a MiSTer FPGA, all the diverse consoles it can run one-to-one with real hardware, and whether or not you think it is worth it for you. Because by the time you watch this video, some of the clones are going to be out, and you can do all of this for around $160 to $180 shipped, versus the around $400 MiSTer FPGA is at the recording of this video. And there's so many different diverse consoles, handhelds, arcade boards, and computers you can run on MiSTer FPGA. I'm just focusing on the console side of things today, because that's what most of you probably collect. But let me know down below in the comments what your main collection focus is. I would be very curious to hear. But the thing about the MiSTer FPGA is it recreates in FPGA logic so many different consoles. Something like the Neo Geo AES here, one of my favorite consoles of all time. I have a large collection for it and I absolutely love it. But now today, if I want to play a Neo Geo game, I just reach for my MiSTer FPGA. It's quicker, it's easier, it has RGB out as well as HDMI video. It allows me to hook up all of my controllers. I can just sit down and play versus walking over to my PVM, changing the leads in the background, grabbing the game off the shelf and plugging it in. And don't get me wrong, there is something romantic about putting a large AES cartridge into a Neo Geo, hooking it up to a CRT television and playing, but if you're busy like me and maybe you have an hour a night to actually play games if you're not making videos about them, it can sometimes become cumbersome. And the best part about MiSTer FPGA is you can use pretty much any controller you could possibly imagine, including the original controllers for your hardware. So if you want to use the original Neo Geo AES arcade stick here, I have modified mine with a noob stick and buttons. You can 100% do that. If you want to play with a Super Nintendo pad, you can do that too. It gives you the freedom to choose whatever you want to do and play games however you want to play them. But really what it does give you back the most, in my opinion, is time. If I decide I'm not actually in the mood for Neo Geo and want to play a Super Nintendo game instead, I'm about 10 seconds away from switching out the game and just deciding what core I want to play. And that is one of the massive upsides of MiSTer FPGA. It gives you back a lot of the time, and if you're like me, you don't have all the time in the world. Additionally, with some older hardware like PlayStation 1, it is much easier to deal with because so many PlayStation 1s have laser problems. This PS1 right here will never play Redbook audio. I have no idea what's wrong with it. I have tried to fix it and it basically just sits on my shelf as a little bit of a showpiece. But with MiSTer FPGA, as opposed to PlayStation 1, I can sit down, play every single PlayStation 1 game I want to. It's going to be crystal clear with HDMI or RGB out. We're going to get 24-bit color mode, and again, I don't really have to worry about whether or not it's going to read a disc, because obviously MiSTer FPGA is not playing the original medium that the games came on. For some of you, that's going to be a deal breaker. For me, I kind of pick and choose when I want to put real games into real hardware and when I just want to load up my MiSTer FPGA. But that is a choice you need to make, because again, sometimes I get it, that nostalgic factor of taking the disc out of the case, looking at the manual and popping it in and watching the real hardware spin it up can be a fun time. But for the most part, with this original hardware, again, you need to maintain it, and keeping all my consoles in working order is definitely a job. I have a secondary PlayStation 1 that I use for games that is modded to be region free. Something like Sega Saturn, one of my favorite consoles of all time, I keep this permanently hooked up to my PVM in my office where I record and basically do all of these videos. It is an absolutely amazing console, and while the MiSTer FPGA core is not done yet, it is like 98% of a replacement for a real console. And that is something that you really need to decide whether or not it's worth playing over the real hardware. And if you don't own a Sega Saturn, you're thinking about maybe it's time to pick up a console and a Saru, that is a great choice. I absolutely have those. I've got a couple hundred Sega Saturn games on the shelf that I will take off and play, but once this core is 100% complete, my de facto go-to when I want to play Sega Saturn is just going to be MiSTer FPGA, because again, I can hook it up to my television in HDMI without having to modify a console, and if I don't feel like sitting in my office and playing on my PVM, if I just want to sit on the couch while my wife reads her phone and play some Saturn, MiSTer FPGA has that. And before you leave the comment, yes, I know software emulation exists. It's an excellent option for every single piece of hardware I'm showing here. I use software emulator emulation as well for the channel and just for some general gameplay when I don't really feel like doing anything other than sitting on my laptop. And again, you can get a flash cartridge for the Sega Saturn. It's one of the cheaper ones you can get, and that's definitely nice too. There's so many options on the market for real original hardware, so you can still enjoy the console but not have to worry about the original media. GDEMU on the Dreamcast side of things, something like a Saru on Saturn. There's so many different PlayStation 1 loaders, and every single cartridge-based hardware has a multi-cart. But honestly, MiSTer FPGA is a great Saturn, you just can't fit it in the drive door. Now, for something like NES and Famicom Disk System, I absolutely do not play my original hardware anymore. It is locked to just basically being a composite signal, and dealing with it is just kind of a pain in the ass. And if I want to play in my living room, even on a scaler, composite just really isn't the greatest thing in the world. And yes, I know you can get HDMI mods, RGB mods for this hardware, but it's expensive, it's cumbersome, and it takes a lot of time if you do it yourself, or you need to pay somebody to do it for you. Where MiSTer FPGA has the entirety of the NES, Famicom, and Famicom Disk System working in FPGA, and you can just sit down and play. And trust me, if you get into Famicom Disk System collecting, you need to make sure that the disc reads when you buy it, because a lot of these get sold untested, and the disc is either completely blank or overwritten with a different game at one of the kiosk readers in Japan back in the day. So it's something that's even difficult to know whether or not you're getting a working copy unless you buy from somebody you trust. And even then, floppy disks are not the best for long-term media. You will and can have read errors on these things. So this is the type of thing, if you want to play Famicom Disk System games, you're not into it yet, MiSTer is a great option. And yes, there are different USB optical drive emulators for the Famicom Disk System and Famicom, so you can play those FDS games without putting the discs in. And honestly, if I do use the original hardware, that is what I do. But again, looking at real hardware captures here using the RetroTink 4K, it does look good for composite, but again, if I want to play in my living room television, MiSTer gives me all those options. And if I still want that composite look, I can just do that out of MiSTer FPGA with I/O boards as well. And honestly, even keeping this drive functioning, keeping the belts lubricated, making sure they're not getting brittle, aligning the heads, another full-time job. And that's the nice thing about MiSTer as well. You get so many different diverse boards to do whatever you want. You have I/O Direct, which is just out now, as well as the Analog Pro, both giving you 24-bit color on the cores that support them. But with these boards, you can get composite, you can get component, you can get S-Video, you can get RGB, you can, even if you're creative, get some RF out of it. So if you want something like that Famicom look in composite, it can do that as well. And obviously the quote-unquote impossible core, the one we all thought would never work, Nintendo 64, is like 98% to the way of a real Nintendo 64, but there are a few issues in the core that keep it from being one-to-one perfect with real hardware. But even with that, the tiny little difference is, if I just feel like sitting down and playing Nintendo 64 again, I just reach for my MiSTer FPGA, because it gives me that RGB out, it gives me the HDMI out, and it looks better than a stock Nintendo 64 ever could, because honestly, the video output on a stock N64 has never been something I like. And being able to capture these games, talk about them on YouTube, play them from my couch, play them from my PVM with one device that fits in the palm of my hand has really been an amazing experience. That is why I love MiSTer FPGA so much, even though I am a very large original hardware collector on the console side, on the arcade side, on the handheld side, everything. But one of the best things about MiSTer FPGA is if you're around during the development of the cores, you actually get to participate in a group of people that are all motivated to see the same thing happen. It is a very fun community. For the most part, everyone behaves and is extremely nice, and if they're not, you can tell me about it and I'll go hit them. But honestly, even if Nintendo 64 isn't perfection, I still love playing it on the core. And just to quickly touch again on other consoles, something like a Duo-R here, you need to have a multi-cart for the HuCard slot. And as far as the CD-ROM drive is concerned, there are a few options out there, or you can just burn CDRs, but honestly, I'm so glad to be away from the days of trying to burn discs and get them to run in my hardware before I actually invest in the game. And there's just so many amazing pieces of hardware on MiSTer FPGA. If you're not familiar with the library, it is a great place to learn and get started. Maybe you play core and you fall in love with something like PC Engine and you don't own hardware, and you decide you actually want to have the real thing on the shelf. MiSTer FPGA is a perfect preview library for you to check out things maybe you've never played before, and you can kind of decide from there. But the question is real hardware obsolete? And the answer is, it is if you want it to be. If you don't want to collect these consoles, if you don't want to have an original collection of games, if you just want to play one-to-one accurate representations of the hardware, then MiSTer FPGA is an amazing choice. If you want to be like me and do both, you're going to have a lot of space and even less common sense, but those are two things I have and don't have in equal measure. But you get to decide whether or not you want to keep your hardware or invest in new hardware, or maybe MiSTer FPGA is for you. Short of that, we're done. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of interesting comments below, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.